Do you remember how happy people were when they heard that Dave Castro was back on the games team? Or do they still feel that way? Picking up the conversation from where we left off last video, we're once again talking about cuts. Only this time, we know exactly who's behind it.
This year, the team was planning on having very minimal cuts towards the end of the weekend. And I came in and I said, no, we're gonna go a little more aggressive, which isn't that aggressive, but we're gonna have the cuts after Friday and then the cuts after Saturday. And then on Sunday, we have the final field. And so at this point, I completely own the decision. If I wouldn't have been put back into this role right before a month and a half before the games, the cut schedule would have looked very differently. But I'm owning this. I believe it's the right thing to do.
That's right, Dave Castro took to YouTube this week, and in his week in review, he addressed exactly what was going on with the cuts at this year's CrossFit Games. Now, of course, you can go to his YouTube channel and watch the entire video, but there are a couple of things he says I'd like to highlight because I think they could be viewed in a number of ways. Now, first of all, Dave knows this is not a popular decision.
And one of the things I would say with cuts is, as unpopular as it is, that doesn't mean it's not the right direction to go. I'm not in this role as to win popularity points. I'm in it to make the right decisions that I think drive the sport forward, and I'll go into those in a few minutes, what I think those are that help it and why the cuts are justified. But oftentimes the hardest decisions that we make as leaders are the most unpopular decisions. So I try to make what I believe is the right decision based on a number of factors, which is oftentimes not popular.
So here Dave talks about making the right decision to progress the sport versus the decision that will be most popular. Now, while it's true that the right thing might not always be the most popular decision, you do have to wonder how many people have to have a negative view of a decision before it hits a tipping point where maybe that is no longer the right thing to do for the sport. But let's run with this idea that yes, this is the best thing to progress forward the sport of CrossFit, at least in Dave's opinion. The obvious question we would ask is, why?
So all these things I'm saying right now are different things taken into consideration when making decisions like this for the cuts. So I talk about fans, I talk about staff, I talk about judges, staff judges, even the vendors. So what I mean about that is this is not why we're doing it, but one of the things we take into consideration when making this decision.
In the video, Dave speaks about a number of factors that are involved, not necessarily the direct reason for, but involved in making this decision. So he talks about the spectator experience for both the fans at the venue as well as those watching at home. He talks about the workforce, particularly focusing on the judges, for example, and he talks about the vendors. Now, Dave goes into a lot more detail on each of these elements in his video, but really he's talking about the fan experience that by Saturday, Sunday, people are getting a little bit bored or restless watching so many athletes go through the events, or the fact that judges, for example, are overworked and don't get enough breaks between heats or between events, and how beneficial that is for them at the end of the weekend to have a little bit more time before the next event. And then he talks about the vendors and the fact that if there's just constantly events running, that's less people that are walking around Vendor Village and spending money. Now, as you listen to Dave explaining these different points, it's very hard to argue with his reasoning. But that doesn't necessarily mean it screams that cuts are the solution, because it could also be interpreted that just taking less people to the games in the first place would bring about the same results. Now, of course, there's a number of different ways that could look. It could be that teams have their own games at a different time in the year, or a similar thing with the age groups. Or it could just be qualifying less people through semi-finals in the first place. And the reason that that might be the solution comes a little bit more into play when he starts speaking about the athletes themselves.
So with the athletes, it wasn't going to the games was earned and it wasn't given. Earning the right to go to the games was really challenging, and these guys put a lot of work and time and effort into getting to the games. And then at the games now, and I've said this for decades, here at the games, we're testing for the best in the world. We're testing for the top 5, top 10, the people who are going to be the fittest on earth. And oftentimes there's a level of athlete, especially in the past, now they're more well-rounded, but there's a level of athlete that is not at that highest level yet. And that's okay. And so you work really hard through these stages to get to the games, the ultimate test, and now you have to work really hard to stay in that test and to stay in the challenge. You have to, it's not charity. You're not there to just hang on and survive through several days, 4 days of competition. You essentially, as an athlete, have to earn your right to stay there in the games and to compete with the best in the world. And totally, I think that's totally okay, and I think that's totally appropriate for this event, especially after a few days of well-rounded assessment before advancing on.
Earned, not given. So Dave admits that everyone at the CrossFit Games has worked incredibly hard and earned their place there. However, he follows it up with the idea that they need to earn the right to stay at the CrossFit Games. And he talked about athletes that are just kind of hanging in there over the 4 days, so maybe they're fit enough to make it to the games, but they cannot hold their own against the fittest on earth. And that's why, again, the idea of actually taking less athletes through from semi-finals could be a good solution. Because one thing that hasn't been addressed is the individual cost for the athletes, particularly those that are coming from outside of North America. They'll already have had to spend money on travel and accommodation to compete at the semi-finals, and now again to make it to the CrossFit Games. If they're traveling from outside North America, we can understand that's a lot of money for flights, for accommodation, potentially also for visas or other documentation that is needed to enable them to travel. And doing all of that for just 2 days of competition, well, it's a huge investment. And actually, making the semi-finals a much bigger deal, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. When you think about the European Championships or the Euros in most sports, if you win that, it's a huge deal. But in CrossFit, winning a semi-final still always just feels like a happy extra, and the real goal is just to qualify for the CrossFit Games, to make it across that cut line. And we're here that maybe athletes hadn't fully peaked yet, and they were still holding something back for the game, and so we shouldn't be concerned if athlete X has finished a little bit lower than we would have expected considering their performance at a previous CrossFit Games. Of course, at the end of the day, no matter how we might personally feel about it, the cuts are happening. Now, we might not personally agree with Dave Castro's decision to make the cuts, but I'm sure we can all agree that the transparency of Dave coming out and explaining exactly why he's made this decision is something we all appreciate. As always, let me know what you think about the cuts, about Dave pushing forward the sport of CrossFit, or anything else you think I might have missed.